Waters and Stanton opened their first shop in 1973, and here we see a shot of some of the stock circa 1975. I wonder how much of this you can recognise, but of course we've come on a long way since then, and in this video we're going to feature and talk about some of the very latest equipment. Hello once again and welcome to the Waters and Stanton videos channel. My name is Peter Waters. Ham radio call sign is Golf 3 Oscar Juliet Victor. And I'm going to talk about buying equipment, buying basically new equipment, because I get quite a few questions about should I buy this and should I buy that and what do I think of that. Well, you know, it's one of those difficult subjects because you can take into account all sorts of considerations and you can spend a lot of money and lesser amounts of money. Now, for example, on this on these videos, I normally use this small Sony, I say small, but this Sony a6400 camera, which is, I think, about £850. So it's not cheap, but in comparison with a lot of other cameras, it is not expensive. At the moment I'm shooting this part of the video on a more expensive Sony camera, A series Mark III I think it is, which is about twice as expensive, but I'm not quite sure that you'll actually notice any difference when I swap back to this much cheaper camera. We shall see, and you can judge for yourself. Of course, the decision of choosing ham radio equipment is not unique. You get the same with photography, as I've just mentioned, and you get the same with computers. You can spend a lot of money and you can spend a lot less money. And you might start perusing the catalogues, the leaflets on the ham radio equipment. And the problem is that each leaflet is going to home in on what the manufacturer thinks is a good feature. Those are features that they've spent some money developing and they think it's going to appeal to the customer. So you look at the leaflets and you see all these sort of flashes that come up and photographs that come up and say this will do this and this will do that. And you start to think, well, yeah, that's a great rig. And then you pick up the next leaflet and that does exactly the same. It homes in on the features that the manufacturer thinks are great features. I mean, quite often that could well be the case. But they are features which have been chosen by the manufacturer, and you pick up yet another leaflet and you go through the same process again. You think, gracious me, where do I start? Well, I suppose the sensible thing to start off is to ignore all those great bullet points and just look at the basic specification and compare them. You know, compare there's all sorts of features, of course, on radios. Sometimes there's too many, really. But anyway, you look at these features and you compare them and ignore the bullet points. But you know, I'm not even sure that advice is right now. You know, I was once asked at a club talk I was doing, what is the best way of comparing equipment, and what's the best way of making the decision on what you should buy? Well, I think at the time I said, well, ignore the pretty lights and ignore all that sort of stuff and just look at the specification and look at the performance figures. That was quite a while ago, but you know, I'm not sure that answer is correct, at least these days. A lot of equipment now is very similar in its basic performance. And if that concept is correct, then perhaps you might be better off, or at least considering how many coloured lights it's got, what it looks like. Could you live with it? Now, the reason I say this is because I recently listened to a podcast, or video actually, by Bob Sherwood. I think a lot of you will have heard of Bob Sherwood, Sherwood Engineering. And if you want to have a look at performance figures on current gear, you go to sherweng.com, www.sherwengs, that's SHER, and then WENG, which I think stands for Sherwood Engineering. So if you go to sherweng.com, and you'll see all the performance figures from all the transceivers over many, many years. One of the questions asked every so often is, what is the most sensitive receiver or transceiver? Which is the receiver or transceiver that can pick up the weakest signals? Now, it seems to be a reasonable question, and particularly from newcomers, I can understand why you'd ask that. But you know, Bob Sherwood's answer to that is not quite what you might expect. So let me just play this snippet from his video.
The Drake R4C that I'm known for making lots of upgrade kits, 0.2 microvolts, and a K3S. I'm sure you know what that is, with preamp number 1 on 0.2 microvolts. So we really don't have sensitivity issues. The RFI noise is often the limit.
So there we are. What Bob is saying is that current equipment is very similar in terms of its front-end sensitivity. It has no problem in meeting the 0.2 microvolts that was met many years ago. The more important thing is interference, electrical interference around us, and that is something that we sometimes don't have any control over. So looking at the sensitivity figure on a radio is interesting, but it'll be the same from one to another. There's another parameter in receivers called noise floor. Now, noise floor is basically the background noise in a receiver before it receives any signal. So it's quite reasonable to think that that must affect the ability to receive weak signals. So let's see what Bob says about noise floor in current radios.
What is noise floor? And that's a newer term. And we look at those radios I just mentioned, the noise floors are virtually identical. So it's noise floor hasn't been an issue either.
So Bob says that noise floor is no longer an issue. So we're beginning to see a pattern that some of these parameters that in the past we've thought are important, they are still important, but the current designs have easily achieved the optimum and are very similar. So next on the list is something called phase noise. Now this is caused by the internal oscillators of your receiver or transceiver, either an oscillator or a synthesizer. This adds noise to the receiver signal path. So it's another important consideration. But as Bob says, the modern radios don't seem to have too much of a problem with that, and he lists some of them.
So the rigs with this kind of performance, the ICOM line, Flex, Apache, Yellowcraft K3S, the Kenwood 890S, the AZU 101D or MP, and now even the FTDX10.
Now, another parameter that's often talked about is dynamic range, breaking the 100 dB barrier. It's the ability of the receiver to handle strong signals without getting distressed. And, well, let's see what Bob says about this.
So what other big number do we need to worry about? Well, dynamic range, and we'll talk about the magic 100 dB radio. Even though we probably don't need the 100 dB radio, it's not uncommon today. If you go back 20 years ago, you couldn't buy one.
So I think you're getting the picture that the modern radio, in other words, the radios that are currently being marketed by at least the main players, are very good performers. And so perhaps the choice is no longer about the technical abilities, but more about the features. But there is one caveat that Bob did say, and he gave an example. Some of the lesser known names, there's a Chinese radio at the moment called G90, and although it appears to have a very good dynamic range, it actually doesn't. The specification has been measured using different parameters, and in fact the dynamic range appears to be 20 dB better than what it really is. So you can't believe everything you read. But I think the main thrust of what he's saying is if you go for ICOM, Yaesu, Ellicraft, then you're not going to have much of a problem. In fact, you're not going to have any problem at all. The specs and the performance figures are correct, and they're remarkably similar. So it's becoming clear that the technical performance differences between the radios is getting smaller and smaller. I mean, there's still one radio that will be at the top of the list and one will be 4 or 5 positions down, but the differences are quite small. Now, like a lot of things, if you want the best, then it costs a bit of money, and if you can afford it, fine. There are those that are never satisfied unless they've got the absolute best. It doesn't matter to them whether or not they're going to actually appreciate the difference, but it's the satisfaction of knowing that they've got the best. And it's in computers with speed of computers, it's in cameras with the lenses and the size of the image that's stored and so forth. So there's many examples, and if you can afford it, then fine, because it obviously pleases you, and at least you know you've got the best. But for lesser mortals, choices have to be made, and I would suggest that we're now getting to the point where the choice is going to be dictated not so much by the performance, but by the features. In other words, in common terms, the bells and whistles. Do the bells and whistles ring for you, or don't they? I did a video very recently about the ICOM IC705, and it's a radio that I've used a lot over the last few months, and it's a nice radio. It's great for portable operation. But would I consider using an FT818? Well, yes I would, because the FT818 is smaller, and I would suggest it's more robust. All right, it's a lower power, and the performance in terms of the technical performance is probably not quite as good, but I'm not so sure I'd notice the difference. There's a lot of bells and whistles that are on the 705 that are on the FT818, but in pure operating ability, I'm not so sure that I would notice much difference, apart, as I've said, from the power. So I suppose there's good news for everybody in this. If you want the best is out there. But if you can't afford the best, provided you stick to the main brands, you're not likely to be purchasing a radio which is that much inferior to the much more expensive ones. The difference will be on the features. I mean, the features can go on endless. You want a second receiver, you want filters, variable filters and so forth. It's almost endless, and you would really have to look at the brochures to appreciate the difference in features, and only you really know the features that you want. But if you're a newcomer to radio, then perhaps you want to go for something fairly simple and fairly basic to start with. You know, the one mistake you can make, and it can be an expensive mistake, is to buy an expensive transceiver and then find that key features that you actually want to use aren't there. And very often the key features that you want don't become evident to you until you've been operating for a while. So I think unless money's no object, I would say start off with something fairly basic. By all means look at the features, but some of the features that you want you may not know you want, if that makes sense. There we are. And I suppose it's the nature of commerce that some dealers will try and push you into buying the most expensive radios and telling you how wonderful they are and how wonderful they themselves are as dealers. I like to think that we go in a different direction. We think that a customer is, to quote a phrase, for life. I think it's about dogs, isn't it? The customer is for life, and therefore that if we treat them correctly and give them the right advice, they'll come back. It's not really in our nature to push them into the most expensive radios because ultimately a customer is going to come back if he gets good service. You know, I'm sure that a lot of people that watch this video will have their own ideas and come back and say, well, what about this and what about that? It's not intended to be a sort of the ultimate guide in buying a radio. It's really to summarise where we are now and how different it is to what it was, say, 20 years ago. As Bob Sherwood said, things have changed radically. Now, before we close this video, it might be appropriate just to talk about a couple of very popular HF transceivers at the moment. One is the ICOM IC7300, which was bought out or introduced about 4 years ago now, and the Yaesu FT-DX10, which was introduced about a month ago. ICOM were very bold and they spent an awful lot of time developing the IC7300, and I think they caught the other manufacturers off guard because ICOM had the field to themselves for about 3.5 years. It was an SDR-based transceiver using the latest SDR technology, and it included the 4-meter band, and it came in at a price which was pretty attractive. All right, I know £1,200 is not cheap, but when you compare it with other gear and then look at what you get, it was good value for money. And recently Yaesu have sort of caught up eventually and come out with the FT-DX10. Now the FT-DX10 is actually a down market version, if that's the right word, for the FT-DX101. The big difference is that the FT-DX10 has got a single receiver in it, so it's similar to the 7300 in that respect. The main difference with the FT-DX10 and the IC7300 is the FT-DX10 uses SDR after the first conversion. So it uses conventional superhet design for the front end, converts down, and then it switches to SDR technology. The theory being that you get the best of both worlds, and I'm not going to get into that one because you could talk about that for ages, and it's very much a personal opinion. The other difference is that the FT-DX10 will also decode CW and also decode PSK31. One caveat there is that a lot of people want to be able to decode CW, but although it's an interesting feature, in practical terms it's not so useful. I would not want to try and operate CW using a CW decoder to decode the CW, simply because it's not perfect, and it does depend on the CW it's receiving to be reasonably well sent. If that CW is not very well sent, the spacing's wrong, then it won't decode it very well at all, and you'll be left with just a load of rubbish on the screen. So although CW decoding is useful, don't overestimate its capability, because it can cause problems and it certainly won't be foolproof. PSK31 is slightly different. That is pretty foolproof, and it works pretty well if you want to operate PSK31, but of course there are other digital modes now coming along. So where are we with those two radios? Well, they are very similar. The basic specification is very similar, and I've just highlighted the differences between the FT-DX10 and the 7300, but there is a difference in price of around about £400. So it's a case of you pays your money and you takes your choice. Certainly ICOM, the IC7300 is still a popular transceiver, still selling well, and the FT-DX10, of course, once we get reasonable supplies, that will also sell well, as you know, as well as the 7300, I guess. But of course Yaesu have had to play catch up. But it's a good example really of Either radio will give most people what they're looking for. There are one or two features, and you need to sort of look at the brochures to suss them out. But basically they're the same radios, the same bands, same power, same basic performance. Case proven, I suppose. So there we are. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been beneficial to you. And do appreciate you pressing the subscribe button, because it encourages us to keep doing these videos. And in the meantime, keep safe, enjoy your ham radio, because it is a hobby, and see you soon. Bye. Here in Portsmouth, we have the UK's largest warehouse full of ham radio equipment. Check our website or give us a call, and we have excellent after-sales service as well. That's Waters and Stanton for you.